A black single dad walked into the most celebrated restaurant in the city with his 7-year-old daughter on a Saturday night. He had a reservation. He had made it 6 weeks ago. The host looked at him, at his gray sweater, his dark jeans, his daughter in her navy dress holding his hand, and said the table wasn't available. Then, 3 minutes later, seated a white couple who had walked in without a reservation at all. The single dad watched this happen without saying a word. Then he took out his phone, made one call that lasted 40 seconds, and put it back in his pocket. What happened in the next 4 minutes, in front of every guest, every staff member, and the general manager who had just told him to try somewhere else, nobody in that building was ready for. Because the man they had just turned away owned the restaurant. He owned all 5 restaurants in the group. He owned the catering company. He owned the building. And he had come here tonight, the way he came every few months, in his own clothes, under a different name, to see what his restaurant actually was when it didn't know he was watching. Now he knew. If you've ever been made to feel like you didn't belong somewhere you had every right to be, this story is for you. Subscribe, new stories every week. He looked at Stefan, a man of 31 years old, 3 years in this role, rated by the restaurant's own internal reviews as the highest performing front-of-house staff member 2 years running. And he said, quietly, with Arya's hand in his, "The reservation is under the name Okafor, 8 o'clock. Stefan checked his screen, found the name, looked up. "I'm afraid that reservation was released, sir. We tried to reach the contact number." "No one called me," Daniel said. "Our system shows an attempt was made." "No one called me," Daniel said again. Same tone, same pace. Not a correction, not an accusation, just a fact being restated for accuracy. Stefan's smile held. It was a very good smile, professionally maintained. "I do apologize. We had an unexpected party arrive for a private event, and we needed the space. I can put you on the wait list for this evening, but I have to be honest with you. The likelihood of getting seated tonight is quite low." "There are 11 empty tables in this room," Daniel said. Stefan did not turn to look. He knew the count. He had made the count. "Those tables are reserved for later seatings," he said. "I really am sorry. Perhaps there's somewhere else I could help you find for this evening." "Daddy," Arya said quietly, tugging once on his hand. Daniel looked down at her. She was looking at the room behind Stefan with the focused, uncomplicated assessment of a child who had not yet learned to pretend she wasn't seeing what she was seeing. "There's people sitting at those tables," she said, not accusatory, informational. She was pointing out an error in the adult's data. Several of those tables were occupied. Couples, a small group near the window, a family with children considerably older than Arya who were eating bread and looking at menus. Stefan's smile didn't waver. Daniel looked at Stefan for a long moment. He was not angry. He was not performing composure over anger. He was simply present, taking in information, processing it, deciding what came next with the unhurried patience of someone who had learned that the first response to most situations was rarely the most useful one. "I understand," he said. "Thank you for your time." He turned. He guided Arya back toward the entrance. They were almost at the door when the general manager appeared. Her name was Victoria Ashworth. She had been managing Celeste for 2 years, brought in from a celebrated property in London, and she had, in those 2 years, transformed the dining room's reputation for service into something that the city's food press described in terms usually reserved for religious experiences. She had also, in those same 2 years, developed a finely calibrated instinct for the visual assessment of guests, who they were, what they represented, whether the equation of effort to return was favorable. She had been watching the exchange from the far side of the room. She crossed to the entrance now, arriving with the particular momentum of someone who intended to close a situation cleanly. "Sir," she said, "I understand there's been some difficulty with your reservation. I want to apologize for any confusion, but I'm afraid Stefan was correct. We simply don't have the capacity this evening." "It wasn't a walk-in," Daniel said. "It was a reservation made 6 weeks ago." "I understand, and I'm sorry for the miscommunication. If you'd like to rebook for a future date, I'd be happy to personally ensure you receive our best available table." "We came for tonight," Arya said, from beside Daniel, in the tone she used when she felt a fact was being overlooked. Victoria looked at her briefly, then back at Daniel. "I really am sorry," she said, in the way that people said things when they were not sorry, but had learned to deploy the word effectively. Daniel looked at her. He looked at the room. He looked at Arya, who was looking up at him with the specific, patient expression she wore when she was waiting to see what he decided. Not frightened, not angry, just watching, the way she always watched him when she thought the moment was important. He reached into the pocket of his sweater and took out his phone. He made one call. It lasted 40 seconds. He said 4 words to the person who answered. "I'm at Celeste," and then listened for 30 seconds, and then said thank you, and ended the call, and put the phone back in his pocket. Victoria had been watching with the expression of someone who had decided the call was a performance. A man making a show of having someone important to call. The kind of thing people did when they felt they had been wronged and wanted to communicate consequence without being able to produce it. She had seen it before. It never produced anything. She was still holding that assessment when her own phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was a message from the chairman of the hospitality group that owned Celeste, 3 other restaurants in the portfolio, and the catering operation that employed 61 people across the city. The message said, "The gentleman at the entrance is Daniel Okafor. Please call me immediately." Victoria read the message once. Then she read it again. The name Daniel Okafor was not unknown to her. It was in fact extremely known to her. It was the name on her employment contract, on every performance review she had received in 2 years, on the organizational chart that placed her 3 levels below the person who had just texted her. She looked up from her phone. Daniel was standing exactly where he had been standing, with Arya's hand in his, with the same expression he had worn throughout the entire exchange, unhurried, present, giving nothing away. "Mr. Okafor," Victoria said. Her voice had changed, not dramatically, but completely. "Yes," he said. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds in which the entrance of Celeste held a very particular quality of stillness. Stefan, behind the host station, had gone the color of the white tablecloths. 2 members of the floor staff near the service corridor had stopped moving. A couple at the nearest table, close enough to have followed the exchange, had set down their menus. Victoria said, "Would you please follow me?" They gave him the best table in the house. Of course they did. It was the corner table near the window that looked out over the city, the table that the restaurant's own promotional materials described as the most coveted seat in the room, the table that the waiting list for the waiting list existed to reach, the table that Stefan had, 12 minutes earlier, suggested was unavailable for a reservation made 6 weeks prior. Daniel sat. Arya sat across from him and looked at the menu with the focused intensity she brought to all documents that required decisions. A sommelier appeared, then the head waiter. Then the executive chef, a man named Laurent, who had 3 of his own Michelin stars from a previous kitchen and who came out of his own kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, to introduce himself and to say that he would be personally overseeing the evening service. Arya looked at the parade of people arriving at their table with the expression she wore when adult behavior confirmed a hypothesis she had already formed. "Daddy," she said, without looking up from the menu. "Yeah. Are you the boss of this place?" Daniel looked at her. "Yes," he said. She considered this with the thoroughness the question deserved. "Did they not know that?" "No," he said. She turned a page of the menu. "That was their mistake," she said. "It was," he said. "Are you going to be mad about it?" Daniel looked around the room, at the tables, at the light falling through the tall windows, at the kitchen pass where Laurent's team was moving with the precise choreography of people doing what they were genuinely good at. He had built this. Not the building, not the kitchen, but the idea of it. The decision to put something here and make it worth the price of admission. "I'm going to be hungry about it first," he said, "and then I'm going to handle it." Arya found this satisfactory and returned to the menu. She ordered the pasta, which she had identified as the most interesting item on the children's menu, and a sparkling water because it was a special occasion, and she ate with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, tasting, considering, occasionally noting something to herself in the quiet interior way she had that always reminded him of her mother. He ordered the sea bass and ate it slowly and thought about what needed to happen next. He had not always owned restaurants. He had grown up in a house where his mother cooked because cooking was how she expressed the things she didn't have language for. The grief and the joy and the celebration and the ordinary Tuesday that needed to be marked somehow. She had come from Lagos with his father when Daniel was 2 years old, with a suitcase and a folder of documents, and the specific determination of people who understood that a new country was not a gift, but a project that required sustained effort to build correctly. His father had worked long hours at a job that paid modestly and came home tired and ate whatever his mother made with the specific gratitude of someone who understood that a meal on the table was not a small thing. Daniel had understood this early, not because anyone told him, but because he watched it, the way his father's shoulders dropped when he sat down and the first bite of food reached him, the way his mother paid attention to that moment. The way food in their house was never just fuel. It was how they stayed human through the parts that could make you forget to be. He had left that house at 18 with a scholarship, a facility for numbers, and no particular plan beyond the understanding that he was going to build something. He spent his 20s in finance, not because he loved it, but because it taught him how money moved and where it collected and what made people trust a thing enough to put their own resources behind it. He had also spent those years eating. Every city he worked in, every trip, every weekend he had time to himself, he ate everywhere. Not for pleasure only, though it was pleasure, for education. He was learning what made a room feel worth entering, and what made food feel worth the conversation it generated afterward. He was accumulating an understanding that he didn't yet have a plan for, the way some people collected knowledge long before they understood what they were going to do with it. He had opened his first restaurant at 31 with money he had saved and 2 partners he had since bought out. A small place, 40 seats, in a neighborhood that was improving but hadn't arrived yet. He had run it himself for the first 2 years, not because he couldn't afford help, but because he needed to understand it from the inside, and you couldn't understand something from the inside if you were standing outside it. He had seated every table himself on Friday and Saturday nights. He had learned which conversations the room encouraged and which ones it killed. He had learned that lighting was not decoration but communication, that the distance between tables determined not just comfort but privacy, that the moment a guest sat down and felt that the room was glad they were in it, that moment was the product, not the food. The food was what they talked about afterward. The moment was why they came back. His wife, Nadia, had been there for the opening. She had been there for the first difficult year, and the better second year, and the third year when the review came in that changed everything. She had been there when he signed the lease on the second property, and the third. She had not been there for the fourth. She had died in the spring before he signed it, quickly, terribly, the kind of illness that arrived without introduction and left no room for preparation. Arya had been 4 years old. Daniel had been 38 and had spent the 3 weeks after the funeral understanding, in the specific and disorienting way that grief created understanding, that the life he had been building was going to have to be rebuilt from different materials. He had kept going, not because grief had made him hungry for distraction. He was not the kind of man who outran things. He kept going because the work was real, and the work was his, and quitting would have been a different kind of loss added to one he was already carrying. And because Arya needed structure, and the discipline of building something provided structure, and the two things sustained each other in the way that only becomes clear when you are inside them. He had also simply needed the kitchens. He had not fully understood this until the first evening after the funeral, when he went back to the original restaurant at 10 o'clock, after Arya was asleep and his sister was in the guest room and the apartment was doing what apartments did in the absence of a person who should have been in them. He went to the restaurant and stood in the kitchen after service, and the kitchen smelled like what kitchens smelled like after service: heat and clean surfaces, and the ghost of everything that had been prepared, and something in him unclenched slightly. Not healed, not comforted, just recognized. This was a place he understood. This was a place where the logic was intact. He had gone back every evening for a week, then less often as the acute phase of grief settled into the chronic one. But he never forgot what the kitchen had been in that period. Not a distraction, a tether. By 43, the hospitality group employed 312 people. It owned 5 dining rooms, a catering operation, and a small events consultancy. Daniel sat on 3 industry boards. He gave a significant percentage of annual revenue to a foundation that funded culinary education programs in underserved communities, the kind of program that might have found him at 17 if it had existed, and that he was making exist now for someone else. He did not talk about this in rooms where it would function as currency. He had learned early that the surest way to make a thing about yourself was to tell people about it. The surest way to make it about the thing was to do it without announcing it. He came into his own restaurants unannounced whenever he could manage it. Not to catch people out. He had good people. He knew he had good people. But because a restaurant was a living thing, and living things were different when they didn't know they were being observed. He wanted to know what Celeste actually was on a Saturday evening in November, when the owner was, as far as anyone knew, elsewhere. Now he knew. Victoria came to the table after the first course had been cleared. She came alone, without the professional composure she had worn at the entrance. Or rather, she came with it, because it was what she had. But something underneath it had shifted in the hours since she had read the text on her phone, and the shift was visible to anyone paying attention. She stood at a respectful distance and waited for Daniel to acknowledge her, which he did after a moment, with the unhurried patience that seemed to be his default register. "Mr. Okafor," she said, "I want to apologize personally for what happened this evening." "Sit down," he said. She sat. He looked at her for a moment, not with anger. He had processed the anger, if there had been anger, somewhere between the entrance and the table. What was left was something more useful. "Tell me what happened," he said, "from your perspective, not the apology version, the actual version." Victoria was quiet for a moment. This was the thing about Daniel Okafor that nobody who encountered him for the first time was prepared for. He did not perform authority. He did not need to. He asked direct questions and waited for direct answers and was visibly, unhurriedly interested in the accurate version of events rather than the managed one. "Stefan made a judgment call," she said, "based on presentation. He looked at you and made an assessment at the door and acted on it. I saw the exchange and I agreed with his handling." "Why did you agree with it?" Daniel said. Another pause. "Because I made the same assessment he did," she said, "and I was wrong." Arya, across the table, had finished her pasta and was now examining the dessert menu with full professional attention. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "This restaurant exists," he said, "because I believe that the best version of hospitality is the version that treats every person at the door as though they belong here. Not because they look like they belong, not because they're dressed for it, not because they gave a name the host recognizes, because they came, because they're here. That is sufficient." Victoria nodded. "I know," she said. "I believed that too, until tonight showed me I didn't believe it as completely as I thought." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "That's an honest answer," he said. "It's the only one I have," she said. He nodded once. "I'm going to need to talk to the full front-of-house team," he said. "Not tonight, Monday morning. I want a full account of the evening from Stefan, from you, and from anyone else on the floor. I'm not conducting a tribunal. I want to understand what happened so we can make sure it doesn't happen again." Victoria nodded. "There will be consequences," he said. "I want to be direct about that. What happened tonight is not consistent with what this restaurant is supposed to be, and I take that seriously. But the consequences will be proportional, and they'll be focused on making sure the standard is understood going forward, not on making anyone feel worse than they already do." He paused. "Stefan," he said, "how long has he been with us?" 3 years, Victoria said. Performance reviews? Exceptional. 2 years running, highest-rated front-of-house staff member in the group. Daniel absorbed this. Then tonight was a failure of understanding, not of character, he said. That can be addressed. If it were the other way around, the conversation would be different. He looked at Victoria. You've done good work here, he said. The kitchen under your tenure, the March review, the improvements to late-night service, that's real. Tonight was a serious failure. Both things are true. Victoria received this without the relief of absolution and without the collapse of someone being let off, with the specific attention of someone who understood they were being told something accurate and needed to hold all of it. Thank you, she said, for being direct. It's the only way I know how to be useful, he said. She stood. She looked at Arya, who looked back at her with the frank assessment of a child who had been paying attention throughout. Happy birthday to your father, Victoria said. Arya considered her for a moment. He's not born yet, she said. His birthday is next week. We came early because he's busy next week. Victoria looked at Daniel. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the specific expression of a man watching his daughter be entirely, unapologetically herself, and finding it the best thing in the room. Next week, Victoria said. Then I hope you'll both come back. We will, Arya said, with the confidence of someone whose assessment of the pasta had been sufficiently positive to support a return visit. Victoria left. Arya watched her go, and then looked back at her father with the expression she used when she had processed something and wanted to confirm her conclusion. She was embarrassed, Arya said. Yes, Daniel said. Is that enough? Daniel thought about this honestly, the way he thought about most things Arya asked him, not looking for the answer that would satisfy her, but for the true one. It's a start, he said. What matters is what comes after it. Arya considered this and filed it away. Can I get the chocolate thing? She said, returning to the dessert menu. Yes, he said. The big one or the small one? He looked at the menu. It's a birthday dinner, he said. The big one. She allowed herself exactly 1 second of visible satisfaction before returning her attention to the menu. He stayed at the restaurant after Arya fell asleep in the car on the way home and his sister came to carry her inside. He went back inside Celeste at 10:30 and sat at the bar with a glass of water and watched the room complete its evening. The last tables finishing their meals, the floor staff beginning the quiet choreography of close. Laurent visible through the pass, moving through his kitchen with the concentrated ease of a man in his natural environment. The bartender, a young woman named Cassie, who had been with the restaurant for 11 months, set a glass of water in front of him without being asked and said nothing, because she understood that he was there to watch and not to be talked at, which was one of the things that made her good at her job. He watched the room. It was a good room. He had known it was a good room. The food was what Laurent made it, which was extraordinary. The light was what he had specified 3 years ago when he was building the space, warm enough to be intimate, clear enough to see the food. The sound level at 9:30 on a Saturday was exactly what he had wanted it to be, present but not intrusive, the hum of a room that contained people who were glad to be in it. All of this was real. And underneath all of it, on this particular evening, was the knowledge that 2 hours earlier, he and his 7-year-old daughter had been turned away at the door. He did not dwell on this the way some people would have. He was not, by temperament, a person who extracted personal injury from professional failures and carried it as a grievance. What he extracted from this evening was information. The system he had built had a fault in it, not in the kitchen, not in the lighting, not in Laurent's menu or Cassie's understanding of when to say nothing. The fault was in the door, and the door was where everything began. He thought about his mother's house, about the way she had treated every person who came through it, the neighbor who arrived uninvited at dinner, the cousin from far away who showed up with no warning, the friend of a friend who needed somewhere to be on a holiday. The table had simply expanded. It had always simply expanded. Not because his mother was naive about the cost of food or the effort of cooking, but because her understanding of hospitality was rooted in something older and more durable than calculation. He had built a $200 million hospitality group on that understanding, and tonight it had failed at the door. He stayed until the last table was cleared. He thanked Laurent on his way out, and Laurent looked at him with the expression of a man who had heard what happened and wanted to say something about it and was restraining himself with effort. "Say it," Daniel said. Laurent said it. He said it in French and then in English to make sure nothing was lost. He said that what had happened this evening was a dishonor to the house, and that he would like, if Daniel was agreeable, to address the kitchen staff on Monday morning about the same standard he planned to address the front-of-house team about, because a kitchen that knew its dining room was doing things like this would be a kitchen that lost its pride in the work, and a kitchen without pride in the work was a kitchen headed somewhere he was not willing to go. Daniel told him he was agreeable. Laurent nodded as though this settled the matter and went back to his kitchen. Daniel walked to his car in the November cold and sat for a moment before starting it. He thought about Arya asleep in the back seat on the way home, her head against the window, the navy dress slightly rumpled from the evening. He thought about the envelope in his jacket pocket with $12 in it. Then he started the car and drove home. The Monday meeting was not a trial. Daniel had been specific about this with Victoria on Sunday evening, and she had been specific about it with the team when she gathered them that morning. This was not a tribunal. It was a reckoning, the kind that looked at what had happened and tried to understand it completely enough to ensure it didn't happen again. Stefan arrived knowing what the meeting was about. He had known since Saturday night. He had spent the intervening 48 hours in the specific interior weather of someone who had made a decision that felt ordinary in the moment and then became, in retrospect, the kind of thing that exposed something about themselves they had not been aware of. He sat across from Daniel in the small office off the kitchen that Daniel used when he came in, a plain room, no ceremony, a desk and chairs, and a window that looked onto the service corridor where you could see the prep staff arriving for the lunch shift. Daniel asked him to describe what he had seen when Daniel and Arya arrived at the host station. Stefan described it. He was honest. He did not dress it up or reframe it or route it through the language of operational decisions. He said he had looked at Daniel and made an assessment and acted on the assessment. Daniel asked him what the assessment was. Stefan answered directly that Daniel and Arya did not match the profile of Celeste's typical clientele, and that on a busy Saturday evening, a judgment call had seemed both necessary and low risk. What made it seem low risk? Daniel asked. Stefan thought about this. Because I didn't think there would be a consequence, he said. Not because I thought it was right, because I thought it would go unnoticed. The room was quiet for a moment. That's the most honest thing you could have said, Daniel told him. And it's the thing I most needed to hear. He leaned forward slightly. The standard in this restaurant is not contingent on whether someone is watching. It exists because it's right, not because there's a cost to ignoring it. When the standard only holds because someone might be watching, it's not a standard, it's a performance. Stefan nodded. He looked like a man who had understood something he would carry differently from now on. I'm going to ask you to stay, Daniel said, because I think you're capable of more than what happened Saturday, and because I believe that the people who understand their mistakes are more valuable than the people who never make them. But I need you to understand that the standard exists whether I'm in the room or not. Stefan said he understood. I know you do, Daniel said. That's why I'm keeping you. He paused. 2 other members of the floor staff are being let go, he said. Not because their actions were worse than yours. Because in the conversations this morning, it became clear that for them, this wasn't a mistake. It was a preference. And I can work with mistakes. I cannot work with preferences that run against what we are. Stefan nodded again. The meeting lasted 40 minutes in total. When it was over, Daniel sat alone in the small office for a while and looked at the service corridor through the window. He watched the prep staff arrive, watched the first deliveries come through the back, watched the ordinary morning machinery of a working kitchen begin its day. He thought about the 2 people he had let go that morning. He had spoken to each of them directly, not through Victoria, not through HR, directly. He had told them what he had observed, what had been said in their individual conversations that morning, and what his conclusion was. One of them had argued. One of them had cried. Both of them had left. He did not feel good about it. He did not feel bad about it. He felt the specific weight of a decision made correctly that still cost something, which was the most honest relationship with consequences he knew how to have. The changes at Celeste took effect gradually, the way real changes took effect. Not with an announcement, not with a policy document distributed at a staff meeting, but with the accumulation of small decisions made consistently over time that eventually became the character of the place. A new front-of-house training program developed with input from every member of the team that addressed directly and without euphemism the difference between professional judgment and discriminatory assumption. Monthly sessions, mandatory, with case studies drawn from real situations. A revised reservation system that removed the interpretive layer that had allowed Saturday's decision to be made. Confirmed reservations confirmed, released only with direct documented contact with the booking party, no exceptions. An anonymous feedback channel for guests who felt they had been treated differently at the door, not for legal protection, for information. Daniel wanted to know if it happened again, and he wanted the information from the people it happened to. He came into Celeste on an ordinary Tuesday evening 3 months later and sat at a table in the middle of the room, not the corner window, not the bar, a middle table, unremarkable, the kind a first-time guest would be given. The host who greeted him was a young woman named Claire, hired 6 weeks after the Monday meeting. She did not know who he was. She looked at his reservation, made under his assistant's name, as always, confirmed it, took his coat, and led him to the table with the unhurried warmth of someone who was not performing warmth. The service was excellent. It had always been excellent in the kitchen and largely in the room. The difference now was smaller than he had feared it needed to be, and more significant than he had hoped it could become. The specific, hard-to-name quality of a place where everyone in it seemed to understand what they were there for. At the end of the evening, he signed the check under his own name. Claire, collecting it, looked at the signature for a moment. Then she looked at him. "Mr. Okafor," she said, "I hope everything was to your satisfaction." "It was," he said. "It really was." He left a tip that was generous without being theatrical, and walked out into the winter evening with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has built something, watched it fail, fixed it, and confirmed that the fix held. On the Friday of the following week, the actual birthday, the one Aria had been planning for 3 months, they went back to Celeste. Aria wore the same navy dress, which she had decided was the appropriate dress for this restaurant specifically. It was a formal decision made on formal grounds, and she had communicated it without particular sentiment, which was how she communicated most things. The corner table was theirs, not because Daniel had asked for it, because Victoria had reserved it the moment she put the booking in the system, which was the moment he had called to say they were coming. Aria examined the table with the attention it deserved, confirmed that the view was adequate, and sat down. The evening was, in every measurable sense, excellent. Laurent had composed a small additional course that appeared between the third and fourth without announcement, a single bite, precise and complex, something that demonstrated what the kitchen was capable of when it was showing someone something rather than simply feeding them. Aria ate it with appropriate seriousness and said, after a moment of consideration, "That's the best thing I've ever tasted." Daniel said, "You say that every time we come here." Aria said, "Every time I'm right." He could not argue with this. The head waiter brought a small cake at the end of the evening without being asked. On it, in careful icing, was the number 43, and below it a single word that Laurent had added at Victoria's request, because he had heard the story and had wanted to put something of it into the evening. The word was, "Welcome." Aria read it and looked at her father. "Is that for you?" she said. Daniel looked at the cake, at the room, at the tables full of people who had come here because someone had made something worth coming to, and who had no idea, any of them, about the Saturday evening 3 months earlier when the person who built it had stood at the entrance and been told there was nothing available. "It's for both of us," he said. Aria considered this and found it acceptable. She picked up her fork. He watched her eat and thought about his mother's kitchen and the table that always had room. He thought about the envelope in his jacket pocket, still there, still carrying $12 and his name in careful letters, and about the kind of person his daughter was becoming, and the kind of place he had built, and the distance between what those things were supposed to be and what they sometimes were in practice, and how the distance was the work, and the work was ongoing, and this was not a problem. This was just what it meant to build something that was actually worth building. Outside, the city continued its Saturday evening, indifferent and ongoing, full of people making their way toward wherever they were going. Inside, the room held what it held, and it was enough. The standard exists whether anyone is watching or not. The places worth building are the ones that understand this, and the people worth trusting are the ones who hold the line, because it's right, not because someone's keeping score. Subscribe, new stories every week. Every one of them is about someone deciding what they're actually made of.